What if you wanted to harvest successive plantings of the same crop? Instead of just growing a crop once per season and being done with it, what if you wanted to time things so you had maybe a head of lettuce per week? How would you actually do that? Now, it's kind of a confusing topic, and I'm hoping that this video explains some of the basics of succession planting so you can take a crop that's like this, where everything is uniform and kind of coming out of the ground at the same time, and start planning your harvests so that you get an even supply of produce throughout the year. Now, this is something market gardeners have mastered, but the home gardener, you and me, we don't really do this too much, or maybe we don't understand it as much as we could. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get out of the garden, even though it's nice over here. We're gonna go inside and hopefully do a little bit of a whiteboard explanation of succession planting for a very, very basic crop like a radish or a lettuce or something like that. So let's go ahead and figure it out, guys. When it comes to succession planting, let's first start off by defining what it actually is, or at least in this video, one method of succession planting. So basically it's using time, which I'm representing here on the horizontal axis, and spacing, which is not on this chart, to maximize your harvest. So instead of getting, let's say, one crop of radish per growing season, you can actually time it, and so you get multiple successions, hence the name, of radishes. So how do we do this? Well, the reason why it's confusing is because gardeners around the world have different variables, and it's hard to make a across-the-board recommendation. And so what's happening here is you have two sort of hard stops and starts. You have your last frost of the season. So this is where gardening can begin for most people because the ground is no longer frozen. So there's a vertical line at the last frost. Beforehand, a lot of the time you're doing some indoor or undercover growing. In here, you've got the meat of your season. And then over here at first frost, this is when the ground starts to freeze again. And so you're kind of like, okay, well, now I can't grow anymore in the ground. Or you're doing undercover or some hardy crops, right? And so for all intents and purposes, what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna talk about a simple crop and how to get multiple successions of that one crop. And so let's talk about the humble radish. Radish is a great crop for this because you can cram a lot of them in a small space and they grow quickly. The one thing we need to know about radish to really start solving this equation up here is how long does a crop of radish take to harvest, right? That's the number one number that we need. And for radish, on average, this is not across the board, but on average, radish takes about 4 weeks. So this is the golden number. If you can figure out this number for any plant you're growing, then you can start plugging it in up here. So what if we wanted to have successive harvests of radishes every week for as long as we could? Basically, at the beginning of our last frost and at the beginning of our first frost, right? And so let's go ahead and do this. Consider this vertical, the different successions that we can do, right? And so here we go. I'm gonna draw a little box. This box is going to represent growing time for one crop. And so here we can see we've got, this is the growing time. So here's week 3, because I kind of drew it in the middle, and here's week 1, right? And so here is our first crop of radishes growing from 3 weeks before frost to 1 week after frost, because you can kind of start radishes a little early. Now we have our first harvest. It's taken 4 weeks. We're harvesting at this date right here, so I'll just make this a little bit darker of a bar for a harvest. We're harvesting on week 1. Now we want to harvest our second crop on week 2, which means we need to start it 2 weeks before. And so we're going here, we're drawing over, and we're continuing this box. So now we have another 4-week chunk of time in which we're growing our second crop of radishes and then harvesting it on week 2, right? Now we have week 3 right here. We want to harvest again, so we need to plant over here. And this gets a little less confusing once you actually move into the real season, because then you're not dealing with, weeks before and weeks after. You're just dealing with actual weeks. Here's our third crop, and there we go. And so this is how you would plan out a simple crop like radishes, 4 weeks to grow, and you want 1 harvest a week. And so then you have to go basically back in time 4 weeks from the day that you want it. So you want it week 1, go back 4 weeks. You want it week 2, go back 4 weeks. You want it week 3, go back 4 weeks. And so let's do this for maybe a more complicated crop. So let's say chard. Chard is an 8-week-ish plant, but you can harvest chard for much of the season. And so it's not like radishes, which are a root crop. Radishes, you just take them straight out of the ground and then you're good to go. It's a root crop. That's what we eat. We eat the entire root of the plant. Chard, you can use the cut and come again method, which I have a video on my channel I just released. And so how do we do chard? Well, chard, what you would do is you would say, okay, well, it takes 8 weeks to grow chard. I can start chard indoors, which means you can play in this before frost zone, right? This is where the ground is still frozen. You still can't grow outdoors. But if you're growing indoors, of course you can. So let's say we're going to start our chard 6 weeks before indoors, and we'll grow it for 4 weeks indoors. So you've got week 6 to week 2 indoor. Now week 2, because it's going to be pretty, you sort of harden it off right here. Do that hardening off period. Week 2 to week 2 after the frost. Boom. This is where we've transplanted, so it's in ground. And then after this point, it's been alive for 8 weeks. It's been maturing and developing. Maybe it'll take a little longer depending on your conditions. But at this point, you can actually just harvest it until pretty much the end of the season when you get to this this first frost area. And then in here, somewhere in this zone, wherever that is, you're going to have that plant die off. And, you know, maybe it won't die off if you decide to put it under cover. So you could even harvest, we can continue this arrow and kind of put a box around it and say under cover. And this is where season extension type of stuff comes into play. And so I really hope this explains at least a little bit of how succession planting works. And if you have other questions, please let me know. And just to touch a little bit on spacing. And so for something like a radish, let's say you only had 1 square foot to dedicate to radish, just 1 humble square foot, and that's all. You just didn't want to give any more to these poor radishes. So radishes, as we know via the square foot gardening system, can be planted at 16 per square foot, right? Boom. So you could just plant 1 square foot of radish with 16, and then in 4 weeks, you have 16 radishes to eat, right? And so another way to do this, if you still only had 1 square foot to dedicate to your poor little radishes, what you could do is you could kind of think of these as rows, right? And you could succession plant these rows. And so you could sow week 1 of radishes right here. And then next week you would sow another. Next week you would sow another. Next week you would sow another. But what's happening here is week 1, you sow this. These are all barren. Week 2, you sow this. These are barren, and this is a week old. Week 3, you sow this. This one's barren. This is 2 weeks old. This is 1 week old. This is 0 weeks old. Week 4, you sow this. This is 3 weeks old, 2 weeks old, 1 week old, 0 weeks old. You wait a week. This comes out of the ground. So on week 4, this would be coming out, right? We're harvesting this. And then guess what we do? We amend that little section, and then we plant right back into it. And so that is how you would do a succession planting on a very small scale for something like radishes. Well, I hope that was a good look at succession planting for you. I know it can be a confusing topic, and I hope that the way I think about it explained it in a way that makes sense for you. But if it did not, well, definitely let me know in the comments. That's what I'm here for. I want to answer your questions, and I know that there's a whole section of succession planting I didn't really talk about, which would be spacing and how to, maybe continuously harvest different crops. So maybe in the shoulder seasons before your first frost and before your last frost, how do you make the most of those seasons, maybe where you can grow a short season crop and then your main crop and then another short season crop right as the season starts to end. So we can talk about stuff like that on the channel too, but I did want to get sort of the basic level of succession planting out of the way, and so we can understand it, right? So if we understand the basics, then we can get into the more complex stuff. So that's it for now. Good luck in the garden, keep growing, drop a comment. I would love to talk to you guys. Let me know what you want to see in the next video. All right, peace.